So it wasn't until several years ago, after many, many years of identifying as a Unitarian Universalist, that I read a critique about the order of our principles. The writer noted that it started with number one, with the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and then it ended with the respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. The writer said that it fed into our pre-existing emphasis on individualism. They stated that leaning into our interconnectedness was essential for our faith and for the world we live in to survive and thrive. So their argument was those should have been switched. So now we have a new description of our core values. We'll be voting on them in next year's General Assembly. It's a graphic instead of a numerical list. The image is the shape of a 6-petal flower. Many of you have seen it. And the top petal, okay, I kind of admit that humans are always looking for ways that there's something that's given sort of a priority. But the top petal is kind of where you start reading if you're doing clockwise, is interdependence. So it sits where the human eye would start reading. And then it kind of feels to me like interdependence has found its place, where it should rightfully belong, I think, for people of faith. Throughout this year, the Soul Matters themes for our services and small groups will reflect the values in that graphic. So we'll be including generosity, liberating love, justice and equity, transformation, interdependence, and pluralism. And this month's topic is generosity. So we already had one small group on generosity. It's called the Soul Matters group. And we looked at that topic, and it was interesting as folks were talking about it, I kind of watched us move from our hearts to our heads by the end of our discussion. And it was so interesting to see how it impacted the conversation, where the kind of roots of our stories of generosity came from. When it was from the heart, it sort of flowed joyfully and playfully. The stories were generous. They were coming out in a different tone. And then when they stemmed from the mind or from the head, they got kind of murky and complicated and challenging and sometimes even defeating. Being part of that conversation made me aware of how different generosity feels depending on where it begins and how much our thinking gets entangled with the impulse to give. Sharon Salzberg, who is an author and a teacher of Buddhist meditation practices, has reflected on the practice of generosity in her tradition, and she tells this story. I recall a Thai forest master who visited the West, and he was puzzled by the sequence of the teaching we seem to be following here. In Asia, he said, the teachings proceeded from generosity to morality, and then to meditation and insight. But here, we appear to begin with meditation, and then we say something about morality, and only after some time, kind of as an appendix, we teach about generosity. He asked, what's going on? Salzberg said he was right to ask. We like the idea of transformative, transcendental, meditative state, and we're willing to put a lot of effort into that. However, the springboard for genuine meditative states is the cultivation of generosity and morality. And that's what actually allows insight to occur most gracefully and easily. She continues that Buddha said that a true spiritual life isn't possible without a generous heart. Generosity is the first parami, or quality of an awakened mind. The path begins there because joy arises from a generous heart. Pure, unhindered delight flows freely when we practice generosity. We experience joy forming the intention to give through the actual act of giving and recalling the fact that we have given. So I saw that kind of examination of the sequence of Western teaching about generosity mirroring this person's inquiry about the sequencing of our numerical UU principles, which started with the individual and then moved out to interconnectedness. But this life isn't a solo journey of spiritual exploration and personal growth and individual living. It's a life where we are fueled by love, and that love calls us into interconnectedness. And we're kind of humbled by all that is asked of us in relationship with others and in relationship with ourselves. So Salzberg says that generosity is both an internal and an external practice. And since our lives are all one piece, there is an interplay between the internal and the external. We need to have generosity for ourselves. What we do within our own hearts and spirits affects how we live our lives and what we do with our lives. When you study or practice Buddhism, a core practice is mindfulness, and this is the Indian Buddhist tradition, which implies awareness, attention, or alertness. It also includes vipassana, which is insight that's cultivated through meditation. So what comes to you when you are in a meditative state? Salzberg says that everything is based on awareness. It's the ability to pay attention and to see what is true. This is mindfulness. We practice mindfulness to fully inhabit our lives. By inhabiting our lives, she means how we come to reflect on and understand our lives. As you all who know Buddhism realize that it also focuses on attachment. And the Zen teacher Fuyu describes attachment on a website called Zen Buddhism, Simple Wisdom for Happy Living. He says that attachment is a fundamental human experience defined as the emotional connection or bond one develops with people or objects or ideas or even a sense of self. You can tell this sometimes when you're in a transition, like, say somebody retires, that sense of self, I'm an employee and now I'm a person, like you get attached to your sense of self. It's a natural part of being human. Still, it can also lead to suffering if we can't let go of attachments. He continues, from a Buddhist perspective, attachment is seen as a source of suffering and a hindrance to spiritual growth. So therefore, understanding attachment's important to achieving an inner peace and liberation. As we learned earlier, when the Buddha taught, he always began with generosity. The practice of generosity is a powerful path to spiritual awakening. It's the counter story to attachment. It's fundamentally an act of letting go. You can think of it as a way to create more space in your life and in your spirit. The more open, expansive space is, in Salzberg's words, the ideal place from which to undertake deep investigation. Because with this kind of inner happiness and spaciousness, we have the strength and flexibility to look at absolutely everything that arises in our experience. This joy-filled, more flexible and open orientation impacts us in so many ways. We are lighter, we're less judgmental, we're kinder to ourselves, and we're kinder to others. We can weather more of life's inevitable ups and downs with more spaciousness and with more curiosity. I don't know if you find that in yourself. I know that like when I start to get over busy or exhausted, I just don't, that curiosity and spaciousness just seems to shrink a bit. So you can contrast that to space when, we cling to our attachments. Salzberg describes it as when the mind feels brittle and narrow, confined and dark. At that point, you feel on edge, uneasy, and you don't like yourself very much. With all that going on, how easy is it to accept calmly a painful or difficult experience? It's not easy. How easy is it to be with the experience without judging it, to accept it as it is, to allow it to be there? I don't think that's easy either. It's not easy because of the narrowness of the mind that is receiving it. By contrast, a vast, spacious mind doesn't feel so bound and contracted and self-degrading. Buddhists believe that this practice of generosity, known as dana, has a two-folded kind of aspect to it. The first is that it frees our minds from being in that restricted, bound, limited space where we experience that attachment and craving and clinging, which often results in a not so great perspective of others and ourselves. Salzberg says we practice generosity to free our mind of delusion, to weaken the craving and the clinging, so we can find that essential happiness. We also free others. That's the other side of this. We free others when our generosity is genuine, Salzberg said. We realize inner spaciousness and peace, and we can also learn to extend boundless caring to all living beings. I listened to a podcast that I really enjoyed. After this week, I've got all these Buddhist podcasts lined up. One of them was called Insight Hour with Joseph Goldstein. The episode I listened to had Sharon Salzberg speaking about generosity with Joseph. Sharon started talking about how the best way to practice generosity is to start with material things, mainly because that's just so concrete, right? Like that it's just a way to stretch that muscle. It's through this familiar act of concrete giving that we can create a learning ground for other types of generosity. Sharon recommended that we try this practice. Whenever you have a strong thought of generosity, just follow it. Do it. Don't think about it. She notes that the first thought, that little bold thought of generosity, will likely be followed by many other thoughts that are countering that first impulse. She says, just watch those thoughts. That's what I love about Buddhism. Often when thoughts come in, you just watch them. Once you have that first thought of giving, do it, and then just watch what follows after that. She says that as you watch those thoughts, don't give in to them, don't give them any weight, just follow that initial impulse. And then after you've actually given, watch yourself as time passes by. Do you actually regret it? Where is that thought coming from? What is that source? What does it want? Be in this mode of action and then reflection as a student. Do it for the sake of learning about yourself and observe yourself without judgment. Easier said than done. I know many of us judge ourselves as we observe ourselves. She said that it's always helpful to reflect on that initial thought because that is where the Buddhists call purity. That's where the kind of that pure inner kind of essence exists. It's the point of our greatest morality and ethics. Goldstein and Sharon have been colleagues for some time, and they've got to know each other well. Goldstein shared this story about he was doing his meditation practice, and a story came to him, a story that he thought would be illuminating, a great teaching device. And he thought, well, Sharon's writing a book. Maybe I should give her my story. So he thought about that, and then he thought, no, maybe I should keep my story. It's a good story. Maybe I should keep it. And then he decided, no, I'll give it to Sharon, but I think what I'll do is when I give it to her, I'll make sure she knows that I struggled with the thought of giving her the story. His mind was playing this game with him. So finally, he did give the story to Sharon, and of course, Sharon didn't want it. She never used it. But he shared this whole thing that he went through. I believe that we often struggle with these kind of decisions. And he sort of, he laughed at himself as he observed himself, but he also found it a really informative observation of attachment and generosity. A little different from the spiritual practice that Sharon outlined, which was that following that strong impulse of generosity, Goldstein shared practices of generosity that he follows through, whether it's like a large or a little thought. So something little could be just smiling at somebody, letting somebody merge. We have opportunities to practice generosity at all times, to forgive something small that happened in our lives. He also says that as soon as you have that thought, he acts on it. So he's made that commitment. I'm going to say yes whenever I have that thought. These can be simple, kind of kind gestures, or they can be larger acts of generosity. In his words, he says they are way big acts of generosity. And he notes that these way big thoughts of generosity deviate from what conventional people say you should do. He says that since he practices this consistently with little generosities, then when those way big acts of generosity come, he can actually act on them. And he said he's reflected on it and that he's actually just never regretted it. He's never regretted it. His mantra is, in the practice of generosity, there's nothing too small and nothing too big. In the practice of generosity, there's nothing too small and nothing too big. I just wonder what it would be like if we lived with that mantra. How might it impact our lives and the lives of others around us? How might we open up, dislodge the internal lockdown if we follow that impulse? How might it expand the way we move through the world and in our own lives? I know this is like one of those big struggles I have internally all the time, because I want to see myself as a generous person, and then I often don't follow that impulse. And then I live with that sort of judging of myself. There's just a few other ideas that kind of connect with this practice of generosity, and the first has to do with impermanence. And we talked about that last week at our service of grief and remembrance, how nothing lasts forever. Things are always changing. And Salzberg says that she has this friend that from time to time, when she was a child and she first started to talk, her favorite phrase was, "I need it, I want it, I have to have it." She says this over and over again to her poor parents, and Sharon shared, "I thought that it was a perfect description of who we are." You can feel that headlong rush to grasp, to cling, to mold things as we want them, to keep them this way. It's our normal conditioning. But as we learn to give at the most obvious level, giving material objects to others, in that giving we develop the ability to let go, to let things be as they are. We begin to see that compulsive attachment doesn't really bring us any happiness, whereas the benefits of learning to let go, learning to relinquish, being able to give fully with a pure intention is innumerable. It's by recognizing that life is a series of letting goes that we come to accept change, and that we trust that we can continue on with joy and freedom alongside change, even if we might want to resist it. So we lean into interdependence when we practice generosity. The Buddha said that when we offer someone food, we're not just giving somebody something to eat. We're giving far more. We're giving them strength and health, beauty and clarity of mind, even life itself, because none of those things are possible without food. We're offering the stuff of life itself. Salzberg describes a certain brightness that grows within us as we give. I know some of you have felt this. I certainly have. And we're coming into that period of time where we get the story of Scrooge and the Grinch who stole Christmas, and both of those are stories of transformation through generosity. Buddhists describe this as love, or metta, because there is a sense of oneness. Instead of that sense of creating separation and alienation from one another, we lean into connection and goodwill. Love, as you may recall, is what's in the center of that flower with the petals of our values. It's at the core. It's the new image that depicts our Unitarian Universalist values. Salzberg says that in the moment of giving, we're abandoning desire and grasping. We're abandoning ill will and aversion. Aversion creates a separation and withdrawal, a sense of not being at one with the other. Giving is an act of moving forward, of yielding, of coming forth, of coming closer. And we're abandoning delusion as well, because when we perform a wholesome or skillful action, we understand that what we do in our life, the choices that we make, the values that we hold, matter. That Soul Matters group, we grappled with the question of power dynamics in giving, as well as the question of intent versus impact, especially when we get mixed messages about what people need. Buddhism resonates across social classes and to people of very different social locations. We, Unitarian Universalists, we see ourselves as generous people, and in many ways we really are. Yet proportionately, we give far less to congregations than other denominations, so there's a tension there. Those of us who have much are not always inclined to give more. Salzberg reminds us that there are very poor people who have a strong sense of inner abundance. They have enough to share and keep giving, even though from the outside it looks like they have nothing to give. But they don't feel like that. They give what they can. And there are some wealthy people in this world who have a tremendous sense of inner poverty. And it's very difficult for them to let go of clinging to their possessions. It's very painful. It's hard for them to give. It was interesting, one person in our small group reflected how there's like multiple dimensions in oneself around giving, that in one part of her life she's very generous, and in another part, she really struggles with generosity, and I can identify with that. There's just so many ways to be generous, and for most of us, we may be more apt to stretch ourselves in some areas and not so much in others. I think this is worth examining. And it may be an area where responding to that first big thought or little thought could be a powerful exercise. We are creatures of the culture we are raised in, and our parents and family and friends and teachers and colleagues and fellow congregants are as well. Salzberg says we have to loosen our grasping and our clinging. We need to have the courage to defy our conditioning. We need to be aware that sometimes when we're listening to our impulse to be generous, we are swimming upstream against the tide, and it's not necessarily easy. Going with the flow, following societal norms of capitalism, consumerism, saving more than we need, and prioritizing our comfort is easier. Dare I say it feels natural for how some of us were raised. We've been taught to hold on to our hard-earned wealth, to judge others, to determine who is worthy, to ruminate about giving, and to feel wise when we don't give frivolously. Salzberg says the primary question in the practice, and something that she's held as a guiding principle through all her years of practice, is, what do I really need right now in this moment to be happy? What do I really need right now in this moment to be happy? In this past week, I personally have encountered incredible kindness and generosity of strangers. I had a day that I spent with my mom. Some of you saw her last night at the coffee house. She now presents as somebody in need of assistance. She's unsteady. She moves slowly, and she clearly needs extra care. And I saw kindness and care given over and over again as I took her to get her nails done and to lunch and to a meeting with the nurse who manages care on the floor where she lives. I came home from a day that could have left me drained, just feeling transformed by all that we received. Transformation happens to both the giver and the receiver. But that's going to be another sermon. But what I do want to say about the whole thing is that I think I do want to say that I could feel my heart shift that day, as I felt all that generosity coming in. And it was people of all different ages and all different races and ethnicities. So I think as we become students of generosity, to not just watch our own, but to watch others and learn from that. So I'll close with these final words from Salzberg. None of us can do these things perfectly. So if that's your criteria, give that one up. It is a practice. We practice generosity with others and with ourselves over and over again, and the power of it begins to grow until it becomes almost like a waterfall, a flow. This is who we become. This is what is natural. This is how we continuously are able to touch on and deepen a true and genuine happiness. May it be so.